The alien woman, named Lyra, walked through the dusty, barren wasteland. Her steps slow and unsteady. Her body was bruised and battered from the harsh journey she had endured. Her green skin was marked with cuts and dirt, and her eyes were dull with hopelessness. She had once been a strong, proud warrior of her people, but now she felt like a shadow of her former self. Alone, abandoned, and far from home, she had lost all will to fight. Lyra had been betrayed. Her own people, the Trixans, had left her on this forsaken planet, thinking she was no longer useful. They had said she was weak, that she couldn't keep up with the rest. She had been a soldier for years, but now she was nothing more than a burden. Her heart ached with the thought of her family and friends, who had turned their backs on her without hesitation. They had taken everything from her, her honor, her purpose, and now her will to live. She had wandered the planet for what felt like days. The air was dry and the sun was scorching, but it didn't matter. Her body had grown numb to the pain. The planet's landscape was harsh, with endless stretches of sand and jagged rocks. There were no signs of life, no signs of hope. Lyra wondered if she would ever find her way out of this nightmare. Her thoughts grew darker as she trudged forward. What was the point of surviving anymore? Her people had given up on her. She had no reason to keep going. She could barely remember what it felt like to be strong, to feel needed. It seemed like all the warmth and light had been drained from her soul. As she collapsed onto a rocky outcrop, exhaustion taking over her body, she closed her eyes and thought back to her life before everything fell apart. She had been a respected warrior, loyal to her people, but it all shattered when she had failed her last mission. She had been part of a team sent to capture a group of rebellious aliens, but everything went wrong. Her team had been killed in the ambush, and she had barely escaped with her life. When she returned to the Trixan homeworld, she had hoped for understanding, for sympathy. Instead, she was called weak, abandoned to die on a planet no one cared about. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at the sky above. She had never imagined it would end like this. Alone, abandoned, forgotten. She didn't know how much longer she could survive. The harsh winds began to blow, kicking up dust around her. Her body trembled from both the cold and the fear. She had given up hope. She had no strength left to keep going. She was certain she would die here, alone. But then something caught her attention. A noise. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. Lyra lifted her head, her heart racing. It was the sound of a ship. Her mind struggled to comprehend what she was hearing. A ship. Out here, in the middle of nowhere. Her eyes darted around, but all she could see were the same barren rocks and endless sky. The noise grew louder and closer. Lyra's breath quickened, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know if it was real or just a figment of her desperate mind. But the sound was unmistakable. A ship was coming. For a moment, Lyra felt a flicker of hope. Could it be? Could someone be coming to save her? Or was this just another cruel trick of fate? Her body, weak and drained of energy, struggled to move. She tried to stand, but her legs gave way beneath her. She fell back to the ground, her body refusing to cooperate. But she wasn't ready to give up just yet. She had to see. The ship appeared on the horizon, its shape growing clearer with each passing second. It wasn't large, but it was coming closer at a steady pace. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. She pushed herself to her hands and knees, her eyes never leaving the ship. It was a human ship. She could tell from the design. Sleek, simple, but clearly not of her people. Her heart sank. Humans. What were they doing here? She had heard rumors about humans, that they were dangerous, that they were conquerors, that they cared only for themselves. The Trixans had always spoken of them with fear and disdain. She had never met a human, but the stories made her believe that they were enemies, just like her people had said. She was about to turn away and hide, afraid of what might happen, but something stopped her. The ship touched down softly on the rocky ground, and the door opened. A figure stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a uniform she didn't recognize. His eyes scanned the horizon before they settled on her. Lyra froze. She expected to see anger, hatred, or even indifference in his gaze, but instead, all she saw was curiosity. He didn't look like the kind of man who would hurt her. He looked kind. The human slowly walked toward her, his steps measured, cautious. Lyra wanted to hide, to run, but her body was too weak. She had no strength left to move. The man reached her side and knelt down. He didn't speak, but he offered her a water bottle. Lyra looked at it, unsure, her mind racing. She was afraid, but the thirst in her throat was unbearable. She took the water, her hands shaking. "You're safe now," the human said softly, his voice calm and reassuring. The human who saved her. Lyra's hands shook as she held the water bottle. Her mind was still in shock. A human. She had always been told that humans were cold, ruthless creatures. But this one, he was different. He didn't seem angry or aggressive. He wasn't even afraid of her. In fact, he looked at her with something she hadn't seen in a long time. Compassion. The human sat beside her, not too close, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. He studied her carefully, his eyes taking in the bruises, the dirt, and the exhaustion that clung to her like a second skin. His uniform was simple, but it had a look of practicality and strength. He wasn't like the soldiers she had known back home. Cold, calculated, and strict. He looked kind. "You're not from around here, are you?" The human's voice was soft, his tone surprisingly gentle. His accent was unfamiliar, but the words were clear. Lyra's mind was still spinning. She wasn't sure if she could trust him. How could she? He was human, after all. Her people had taught her to fear them, to avoid them at all costs. But now, here he was, offering her help, offering her hope when she had none left. She couldn't find the strength to speak at first, her throat too dry. But the human seemed patient, waiting for her to gather her thoughts. He didn't pressure her to answer. He just sat there, watching her, letting her take her time. Finally, she spoke, her voice hoarse. "Who are you?" The human smiled faintly, his eyes softening. "My name's Mark. I'm a scout. I was sent here on a mission, but I didn't expect to find anyone out here. Not like you." Lyra glanced up at him, her mind racing. A scout. What did he mean by that? Was he here to search for something? Or someone? Her heart pounded in her chest as she wondered if he had been sent to find her. Was she being watched? Were the Trixons looking for her too? "I'm Lyra," she said, unsure of what else to say. I don't belong here." Mark nodded, as if he understood. "You're far from home," he said softly, his gaze never leaving her face. "But you don't have to be alone anymore." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had been alone for so long, abandoned by her own people. The Trixons had cast her aside, treating her like nothing more than a failure. They had left her to die on this barren planet. But this human, Mark, was offering her something she hadn't felt in ages. A chance to survive, a chance to hope again. Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She didn't know if she could trust him, but she didn't have the strength to turn away. She had been on the brink of death, and now here was a human, offering her life. Was it a trick, or was this real? Mark must have seen the doubt in her eyes. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small medical kit. He didn't speak at first, just began to gently clean her wounds. His movements were careful, as if he was used to taking care of others. Lyra watched him closely, still unsure of his intentions, but she couldn't stop herself from feeling a sense of safety in his presence. As he worked, Mark spoke quietly. "I know you're probably scared. I don't blame you. I've heard the stories too. About your people. About what they did to you." Lyra flinched at his words. She had never expected a human to know anything about the Trixons. How could he? Her people were distant and secretive, their actions hidden from the rest of the galaxy. Yet, somehow, This man knew about her betrayal. "They left me to die," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They thought I was weak." Mark paused for a moment, his hands still. His eyes softened with something that looked like sympathy, but there was also something more in his gaze. Understanding. He didn't judge her. He didn't question her. He simply looked at her with respect. "You're not weak," he said quietly, his voice firm. "You're alive. And that means something. It means you're strong." Lyra felt a knot form in her throat. She had always been taught that strength came from power, from dominance. But this man, this human, was showing her a different kind of strength. He wasn't showing her force. He was showing her care. He was showing her that survival wasn't just about strength in battle. It was about the strength to keep going, even when everything felt lost. "Why are you helping me?" Lyra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand. I've been told. Humans aren't kind." Mark finished cleaning her wounds and gave her a reassuring smile. "Not all humans are the same. We're all just trying to do the right thing. Sometimes that means helping someone who needs it." Lyra's eyes searched his face, looking for any sign that he was lying, that he had some hidden agenda. But she found none. All she saw was sincerity. She couldn't explain it, but something about him made her believe him. "I don't know what I can offer you," she said softly, her voice filled with doubt. "I'm not strong. I can't fight. I don't have anything left." Mark leaned back slightly, giving her space. "You don't have to offer anything. You've been through enough. You don't owe me anything." The words were simple, but they hit her like a wave. She didn't owe him anything. She didn't have to prove herself to him. For the first time in a long time, Lyra felt a sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry the weight of her past on her own. Mark extended his hand to her, a silent offer of help. Lyra hesitated for a moment, then took it. The touch was warm and steady, and it gave her the strength to stand up. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time, she was willing to find out. "I'll stay with you," she said quietly, "for now." Mark smiled, nodding. "That's all I ask." The long journey. Lyra stood beside Mark as the human ship hummed softly, ready to take off. She wasn't sure what to expect next, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't alone. The small ship was a strange mix of technology she had never seen before, but the hum of its engines brought her a small sense of comfort. It was a sound of hope, something she had nearly forgotten in her time of isolation. The sun was beginning to set on the barren planet. The orange sky stretched out above them, a reminder of the harsh world she had almost been left to die on. As Mark made the final checks on the ship, Lyra stayed near the open hatch, still unsure of her next step. What had brought this human here? Why was he helping her? And where were they going? Mark looked over at her as he secured the hatch. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. His expression was calm, but there was a glimmer of concern in his eyes. Lyra nodded slowly. She didn't know how to answer. She wasn't sure if she was okay, but she wasn't ready to say anything else. She had spent so much time being afraid, being distrustful, that it felt strange to even think about something else, something better. But Mark, in his quiet and patient way, was offering her a new chance. She just didn't know if she was ready for it. The ship slowly lifted off the ground, rising into the sky as the planet beneath them grew smaller and smaller. Lyra could feel the shift in her chest. Leaving the planet felt like leaving behind all the pain, the loneliness, and the betrayal. But it also meant stepping into the unknown, a future she couldn't see. Her old life felt so far away, and she had no idea what kind of life awaited her with Mark. For the first hour of their journey, the silence between them was heavy. Mark focused on flying the ship, his eyes glued to the control panel in front of him. Lyra sat back in the small seat, her hands resting in her lap. She stared out the small window, watching the stars stretch out in front of them, like little dots of light in the vast dark of space. It was beautiful, but it also felt overwhelming. How could she be a part of something so big? What place did she have in this vast universe, now that everything she had known was gone? Eventually, Mark broke the silence. I know it's a lot to take in. You've been through a lot. But I promise you, I'm not going to leave you. Lyra glanced at him. His words were simple, but they carried so much weight. He wasn't leaving her. The thought of that felt strange, yet comforting. She had never had anyone say that to her. Not even her closest friends in the Trixen army had ever promised her anything like that. I don't know what to do, Lyra admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know where I belong anymore. Mark's eyes softened as he turned to look at her. That's okay. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Just take it one step at a time. You're not alone in this. Lyra nodded, but she didn't respond. It felt like too much to explain. Her past, her failure, her betrayal, they all weighed heavily on her heart. It was hard to even think about the person she used to be. But Mark, the human who had saved her, didn't judge her. He didn't ask her to explain. He just accepted her as she was, even though she wasn't sure what that was anymore. The journey felt long, even though they had only been traveling for a few hours. Lyra could feel the exhaustion starting to catch up with her. She hadn't slept properly in days, and her body was still weak from the hardships she had faced on the barren planet. She leaned back in her seat, trying to relax, but her mind kept racing. What happens when we reach your ship? Lyra asked, breaking the silence again. Her voice was low, uncertain. Mark hesitated for a moment before answering. We'll figure it out. I'll get you the help you need. There are people who can help you recover, give you a safe place. You don't have to be on your own anymore, Lyra. His words were simple, but they struck a chord deep inside her. She had never imagined that someone could care about her this much. After everything she had been through, she hadn't expected to find kindness. She had expected suspicion, fear, and rejection. But Mark had shown her something different. I don't deserve your help, Lyra said softly, looking down at her hands. I've failed. My people left me because they thought I was weak. Mark didn't say anything at first. The ship hummed as it moved through the vast emptiness of space. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. Lyra, your worth isn't decided by what others think of you. It's not decided by where you come from or what mistakes you've made. It's about who you are now. And right now, you're someone who deserves a chance. Lyra felt a wave of emotion crash over her. She hadn't heard anyone speak to her like that in years. For so long, she had been taught that worth was based on strength and ability. But Mark was telling her that she had value just because she was alive. Because she was here. I don't know if I can ever be the person I was, she said quietly, her voice breaking. But I want to try. Mark turned his head slightly, giving her a small smile. That's all I'm asking. You don't have to be anyone but yourself. Lyra took a deep breath, feeling something shift within her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could believe in something again. She wasn't sure what would happen next or where this journey would take her. But she knew one thing. She wasn't alone anymore. Her painful past. The days passed slowly as the ship drifted through the stars. Lyra spent most of her time sitting by the window, staring at the endless black space. The stars were beautiful, but they didn't bring her peace. Instead, they reminded her of everything she had lost. Her old life, her family, her people. The world she had once known seemed so far away now. It felt like a dream she could never return to. Mark didn't push her to talk. He let her be, understanding that the weight of her past was too heavy for her to share right away. But even though he was patient, Lyra could feel the tension in the air between them. She wanted to tell him everything. The truth about what happened to her, about the Trixens, and about how she had ended up alone on that forgotten planet. But the words were hard to find, stuck in her throat like a lump she couldn't swallow. One evening, as the ship hummed steadily through the stars, Mark broke the silence. He had been working at the control panel, but now he turned to her, his expression kind but serious. "Lyra, I know you've been through a lot. I don't want to push you, but if you ever feel ready to talk about it, I'm here." Lyra's heart tightened at his words. The kindness in his voice made something inside her break. She had been running from the truth for so long. She had tried to forget everything that had happened to her. But now, here with this human, something inside her needed to be released. She looked away from him, staring down at her hands. They were still dirty, though she had cleaned them several times already. It didn't matter. Nothing seemed to matter anymore. "I was part of the Trixan military," she began, her voice low and trembling. "I was supposed to be strong, powerful. We were trained to be the best warriors in the galaxy. But I failed. I was a failure." Mark didn't say anything. He didn't interrupt. He just waited. Lyra took a deep breath, her chest tight as she tried to keep her emotions in check. "I was chosen for a special mission, a mission to prove my worth. But everything went wrong. I was sent to a hostile planet, a place we weren't prepared for. The mission was supposed to be simple, but it turned into a nightmare. The memories hit her like a wave. The planet was harsh, with storms that tore at the ships and creatures that attacked anything in sight. Lyra had tried to fight, but she wasn't prepared for the dangers. Her comrades had been killed one by one, their bodies left behind in the unforgiving wilderness. She had tried to save them, but it was too late. She was the only one who survived. "They left me there," Lyra whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "My people, my comrades. They left me. They said I was weak. They said I wasn't strong enough to survive. They abandoned me." Mark didn't say anything for a long time. He just watched her, his eyes full of understanding. He didn't judge her. He didn't look at her like she was broken. He just looked at her like she was a person who had suffered and survived. "I didn't know what to do," Lyra continued, her voice cracking. "I tried to survive. I fought for food, for water, for shelter. But every day was a struggle. I was alone, and I didn't know how to keep going. I thought about giving up. I thought it would be easier to just end it. But I couldn't. I kept going." Her hands clenched into fists as she recalled those long, lonely days. She had been so close to death, but something inside her refused to let go. She had nothing left, but somehow she had kept fighting. She had kept breathing. And now, sitting here in this human ship, she realized that she hadn't been alone all this time. She had always been fighting for something that had kept her alive. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe because you're the first person who hasn't looked at me like I'm a failure. The first person who hasn't left me behind." Mark's eyes softened, and he slowly moved to sit beside her. He didn't touch her. He didn't say anything. He just sat with her in silence, letting her feel that she wasn't alone. He wasn't going anywhere, and that simple fact was enough. "You're not a failure," Mark said quietly after a long pause. "You survived. That's more than most could say. You've been through things that would break others, but you're still here. That takes strength, more strength than you know." Lyra looked at him, her chest tight. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the pain, the abandonment, the loneliness hadn't broken her completely. But she wasn't sure. She wasn't sure if she could ever believe in herself again. "But I'm not the same," she said softly, almost to herself. "I'm not the person I was before. I've seen too much. I've lost too much." Mark gave her a small, understanding smile. "You don't have to be the same person. You're allowed to change. You're allowed to heal. You don't have to carry all of that pain forever." For the first time in a long time, Lyra felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she didn't have to be the warrior she once was. Maybe she didn't have to carry the weight of her past alone. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to move forward. "I don't know how to heal," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded. "No one does. But you don't have to do it alone. You have me. And you have a chance to start over. That's more than most people ever get. Lyra looked out the window, her eyes focused on the stars. The past was still there, hovering in her mind like a shadow. But for the first time, she felt like she might have a future that wasn't defined by the pain of her past. And maybe, with time, she could begin to heal. With Mark by her side, she no longer felt like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. Maybe the road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time, Lyra didn't feel completely lost. She had found something she hadn't had in a long time, a reason to keep going. Danger strikes. The ship had been traveling smoothly for days, gliding through the silent vastness of space. Lyra had started to feel a sense of calm, something she hadn't experienced in years. Every day, she felt herself growing stronger, the heavy weight of her past slowly lifting. Mark was always there, a steady presence who never judged, never rushed her. It was a feeling she hadn't thought possible anymore. But deep down, Lyra knew peace wouldn't last forever. Life had always thrown obstacles at her, and even in the quiet of space, she couldn't escape the shadow of danger. The warning beep of the ship's console jolted her from her thoughts. Mark was already moving, his expression serious as his fingers flew over the controls. Lyra felt the familiar tightness in her chest. Something was wrong. "Mark," she asked, her voice trembling with unease. "What's happening?" Mark didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed glued to the console, his face tense. Finally, he spoke. "We've got company. They're closing in fast." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced, memories of her past battles and escapes flooding her thoughts. She knew what it meant when someone was closing in fast. It wasn't good. "Who are they?" she asked, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. Mark's hands worked quickly, trying to adjust the ship's settings. "I'm not sure yet, but they're not friendly. We're not equipped for a fight like this. I need to get us out of here." The ship shook suddenly, a violent jolt that sent Lyra stumbling forward. She grabbed onto the nearest seat, her body already on high alert. The lights flickered above them, and the ship's alarms screamed louder. "Hold on," Mark shouted as he slammed a lever, forcing the ship into a sharp dive. Lyra's stomach lurched as they plummeted, the sound of the engines straining in protest. "Who are they?" Lyra asked again, her voice rising in panic. "I think they're pirates," Mark said, his voice grim. "This area of space is known for their attacks. We must have wandered into their territory." Pirates. Lyra had dealt with them before, though not in the way Mark might imagine. The Trixans were ruthless, but pirates were another breed entirely, savage, unpredictable, and willing to do anything to get what they wanted. Another violent shake rocked the ship, followed by the sound of gunfire outside. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. The pirates had already begun their attack. "We need to lose them," Mark said, his hands flying over the controls as he tried to maneuver the ship. "Get ready, Lyra. It's going to be rough." Lyra's mind raced. She had no combat skills in this kind of situation. She had only ever fought on the ground, against enemies she could see and track. But here, in the depths of space, everything was different. The ship was too small, too vulnerable. She could feel the panic rising, but she tried to push it down. Mark's voice broke through the growing fear. "Lyra, I need you to trust me. I can get us out of this, but you need to stay calm and help me." "Help?" Lyra's voice shook. "How can I help? I don't know anything about ships or." "Just stay ready. We'll need to make a run for it soon, and I'll need you at the controls when we do." "Can you do that?" Lyra didn't have time to think. She nodded, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She didn't know if she could do it, but she had no choice. She had to help. She couldn't afford to let Mark down. Another wave of gunfire shook the ship, this time hitting one of the outer panels. Sparks flew from the wall, and Lyra's heart raced as she watched the damage. The pirates were getting closer. It wouldn't be long before they boarded the ship. Mark swore under his breath as the ship jerked again, the console flashing with warning signs. "We're losing power," he said. "They're damaging the engine. If we don't get out of here fast, we'll be sitting ducks." Lyra's mind scrambled for a solution. She wasn't a soldier, but she had learned to think quickly in moments of danger. Her past had taught her that hesitation could mean death. She pushed herself to her feet and moved to the console, watching as Mark fought to keep the ship steady. "I'll help with the engine," Lyra said, determination in her voice. "Just tell me what to do." Mark looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise. "You sure? I'm sure," she interrupted. "Just tell me what I need to do." Mark hesitated for a moment, then pointed to a set of buttons on the control panel. "The engine's been hit. I need to reroute power to the backup system. You can do that, right?" Lyra swallowed hard and nodded. She had no idea how to work the ship's systems, but there was no time to waste. She quickly followed his instructions, her hands moving instinctively over the buttons and switches as she tried to keep the ship from losing power completely. As she worked, the ship jerked again, and the sound of the pirates' weapons hitting the hull echoed through the metal walls. The panic in her chest flared, but she pushed it down. She had to stay focused. For Mark. For herself. "Lyra, we've got one shot at this," Mark said, his voice steady despite the danger. "We're going to make a run for it. Once you've rerouted the power, I need you to open the main hatch. We'll go full speed." Her hands shook as she worked, but the sense of urgency pushed her forward. She could hear Mark's voice in her ear, guiding her through the process. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was part of this, part of something bigger. She had to do her part to keep them both alive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lyra completed the task. "Done," she said, her voice breathless. "Powers were routed." "Good. Now hold on," Mark replied. Without warning, the ship shot forward, its engines roaring to life. Lyra gripped the console, her body pressed back into the seat as the ship lurched into high speed. The pirates were close, too close, but they were no match for the speed of the human ship. Lyra felt a surge of adrenaline as the ship pulled away, the pirates' ship falling behind. They weren't out of danger yet, but for now, they had escaped. Mark glanced at her, a relieved smile crossing his face. "You did great, Lyra. You really helped." Lyra breathed out a shaky sigh, her heart still racing. "I didn't think I could." "You can," Mark said. "You just have to believe in yourself." A growing friendship. The days after the pirate attack were calm, but Lyra couldn't shake the feeling of tension in the air. They had escaped, yes, but the danger still loomed in the back of her mind. The pirates might be gone, but she knew there were other threats out there, dangerous, unforgiving. And she and Mark were still alone, drifting through the unknown. Despite the uncertainty, there was a feeling of warmth between them, something Lyra hadn't felt in a long time. She had never known what true companionship could be until she met Mark. He was different from anyone she had known. He didn't ask questions about her past. He didn't push her to open up when she wasn't ready, but he was always there when she needed him. He was kind, steady, and unafraid to face danger head-on. Mark, on the other hand, seemed to have found peace with Lyra's presence. It wasn't just that he had saved her. It was more than that. He had seen the strength in her, even when she couldn't see it herself. They had fought together, survived together, and now they were becoming something more than just strangers on a ship. One morning, Lyra woke up to find Mark already at the control panel, his face focused and serious as he studied the ship's systems. She had started to get used to the way he worked, always efficient, always careful. But there was something different today. His usual calm was replaced by a hint of worry. "Morning," she said, walking over to him, her voice still groggy with sleep. Mark didn't immediately respond. He was absorbed in the display in front of him. Finally, after a long moment, he glanced over at her. "Morning, Lyra. We're approaching a nearby planet. I need to stop and get supplies. I don't like how low our fuel is. Lyra nodded. She didn't mind the idea of stopping, but she was already feeling the unease that came with being near a populated world. It wasn't that she feared people, but she was never sure what kind of reception she would get. The galaxy wasn't kind to outsiders, especially to someone like her. Do you think it's safe? Lyra asked, her tone cautious. Mark gave her a reassuring smile. I'll make sure of it. I've been here before. I know the area. She trusted him. For some reason, she felt safe with him. She had never felt that way before, not with anyone. It was strange, but in a good way. As the ship approached the planet, Lyra took a seat beside Mark, watching as he navigated the controls with ease. The planet below was covered in sprawling forests and vast oceans, a beautiful sight from the distance. It looked peaceful, and for a moment, Lyra allowed herself to relax. The ship touched down in a small docking bay, just outside a small town. Lyra stayed close to Mark. As they left the ship, her nerves tingling. She was acutely aware of every step they took, every glance from the locals. She had always felt out of place, always on the run. It was hard to shake that feeling now, even in this quiet place. Mark, as always, seemed completely at ease. He walked confidently through the town, nodding to a few familiar faces as they passed. Lyra noticed that people greeted him with respect, some even with a smile. He was known here. That was a strange thought for her. Someone who was known, someone who belonged. They entered a small market, where Mark quickly began to gather supplies. Lyra stayed close by, scanning the shelves, but her mind was elsewhere. She felt like an outsider. The humans around her looked at her with curiosity but didn't say anything. Lyra was used to being different, but she couldn't help feeling like she didn't belong. Mark came back to her with a bag of food and other supplies, his face bright with a sense of purpose. We've got everything we need, he said, his voice cheerful. Let's head back to the ship. Lyra nodded, but her mind was still preoccupied. The stares from the humans in the market made her feel exposed. She didn't want to be seen as different. She didn't want to be a reminder of what she had lost. But more than that, she didn't want to be a burden on Mark. She could see the way people looked at them, and she didn't want to make things difficult for him. As they walked back to the ship, Mark noticed the quiet distance in her steps. He didn't say anything right away, but he slowed his pace to match hers. When they reached the ship, he turned to her, his expression serious but kind. Hey, you all right? He asked gently. Lyra forced a smile, trying to push the unease away. I'm fine, she said quickly. Just tired. Mark studied her for a moment, then nodded. You don't have to hide from me, you know. You've been through a lot. I'm not going to judge you. I just want to help. Lyra hesitated, feeling a lump form in her throat. I don't want to be a burden, she admitted. I know I'm different, Mark. I know people notice. I don't want you to have to deal with it. Mark placed a hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture that felt comforting. Lyra, you're not a burden. You're not different in a bad way. You're strong. And you've got me now. I don't mind helping. I want to help. For the first time since they had met, Lyra let herself believe him. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for her to start over, to build something with someone who cared. Mark wasn't just the person who had saved her anymore. He was a friend, a real friend. She met his eyes, her heart softening. Thank you, she said quietly. I'm not used to this, but I think I'm starting to trust you. Mark smiled, his eyes warm. That's all I can ask for. You've already done so much for me, Lyra. I'm just glad I can help you too. They stood there for a moment, the weight of their words settling between them. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Lyra felt like maybe they could face it together. As they boarded the ship, the hum of the engines filled the air, and Lyra knew something had changed. She was no longer alone in this vast universe. She had a friend now, and that made all the difference. A new beginning. The ship's engines hummed steadily as it glided through the empty expanse of space, leaving behind the small planet they had just visited. Lyra stood by the window, gazing out at the stars, her thoughts distant. It felt strange to be in motion again after the quiet, peaceful days on the planet. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She had found something here, something she hadn't realized she was looking for. A sense of belonging. A place in the universe, even if it was just for a moment. Mark had given her that. Mark, the human who had saved her when she had given up on herself. The human who had been by her side through every challenge, every moment of fear, every setback. The human who had shown her that not everything in the galaxy was cruel. Lyra had always thought that she was alone, that her past, her mistakes, would forever keep her isolated. She had carried the weight of her history with her like a chain, never letting anyone get close. But Mark had broken down that wall, piece by piece, just by being himself. By being kind, by being patient. She turned away from the window as Mark entered the room, carrying a small tray of food. He looked as relaxed as always, but there was something in his eyes today that she hadn't seen before. A quiet determination. He said with a soft smile, setting the tray down on the table. I thought you might want something to eat. Lyra smiled back, her heart warming at the sight of him. It felt like they had known each other forever, though in reality, it had only been a few weeks. Time felt different in space, as if it moved slower, or maybe it was just that she wasn't looking at the clock anymore. Thanks, she said, walking over to the table and sitting down. I didn't realize how hungry I was. Mark took a seat across from her, his eyes still focused on her. But this time there was a new energy in his gaze, something like hope. Lyra couldn't help but notice it. I've been thinking, he said after a moment. Maybe we should head to a new part of space, somewhere we haven't been yet. A fresh start, you know. Lyra raised an eyebrow, surprised. A fresh start. I thought we were already on our way to. Mark chuckled softly, shaking his head. Not a fresh start on a planet or anything. I mean a new journey. A place where we can both just breathe. Not running, not hiding. Just living. Together. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. The thought of starting over, without fear, without the weight of her past hanging over her, it was more than she had ever hoped for. But even so, a small voice in her mind wondered if she was ready for it. Could she truly let go of everything she had been? Could she trust someone enough to build something new? Mark seemed to read her thoughts, his expression softening. You don't have to decide anything right now, he said gently. But we've both been through so much. Maybe it's time to finally find a place where we can both feel safe, a place where we don't have to look over our shoulders. Lyra looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of doubt, but all she saw was sincerity. He wasn't asking her to forget everything. He was asking her to trust him, to trust in the possibility of something new. For the first time in a long while, Lyra felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't used to it, but it was there. She had lived in fear for so long that the idea of peace seemed foreign. But Mark was right. Maybe it was time to stop running. I think I'm ready, she said quietly, her voice shaking a little. She wasn't sure if she meant it completely, but she was willing to try. For him. For them. Mark smiled, his eyes bright with relief. We'll figure it out together, one step at a time. For the next few hours, the two of them worked together, looking over star maps, planning their next move. Lyra felt an unfamiliar feeling in her chest. Excitement. The idea of setting off into the unknown with someone she trusted, someone who cared for her, was more than she had ever dreamed possible. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would still be challenges ahead. But this time, she wasn't alone. As the night settled over the ship, Lyra found herself standing by the window again, watching the stars pass by. The vastness of space stretched out before her, endless and mysterious. But this time, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel like a lost soul drifting in the darkness. She felt at peace. Mark stood beside her, quietly looking out at the stars as well. They didn't need words. They didn't need to say anything. The quiet understanding between them was enough. It spoke louder than any words could. "We don't know what's ahead," Lyra said softly, breaking the silence. "But we'll face it together." Mark nodded, his hand brushing against hers. Together. Lyra smiled, the first true smile she had worn in years. She didn't know where their journey would take them. But she knew one thing for sure: they had each other. And that was all that mattered. As the ship sailed into the unknown, Lyra felt a sense of freedom she had never experienced before. This was a new beginning, not just for her, but for both of them. And with Mark by her side, she knew that anything was possible.